In this short video, I'll show you the 4 major methods of using a caliper to measure objects.
I have a PVC pipe in front of me. Let's assume I need to measure the exterior of the pipe. What I would do is I would take my caliper, push it fully closed, hit the 0 button to be sure it's zeroed out. I would then use the exterior claws, those are the big ones on the bottom, to measure the exterior of the pipe. And I can see quickly that that pipe is 48.2 millimeters. If I needed to measure the inside of the pipe, I would use the interior claws. Those are the smaller ones on top. I would place them inside the pipe and spread them as far as they can go, making sure to hit the fattest part of the pipe, and I can see that is 40.6 millimeters. The exterior claws can also be used for measuring other objects. For example, a piece of wood. If I needed to know how thick that piece of wood is, I would push my caliper closed, hit the 0 button, use the exterior claws, pull it shut, and I can take a look, and I can see that it's 19.4 millimeters. There are 2 examples of how to use the interior and exterior claws of a caliper.
You've seen how to measure the interior and exterior of an object. Now let's look at how to use the depth gauge to measure the depth of a hole, such as perhaps a hole drilled into a piece of wood, so you know how deep it is.
You'll notice that there's a piece of wood in front of you. In that piece of wood, there is a slot. Let's assume that you need to determine the depth of that slot. How would you go about doing that? Well, the answer is, of course, you would use a caliper. Most people think about calipers, they're only thinking about measuring the distance between the jaws. What a lot of people don't notice is, when you're operating a caliper, there's also a depth gauge coming out of the bottom. This allows you to measure, as the name would indicate, the depth of an object. The amount the depth gauge is sticking out exactly matches the distance between the jaws, and therefore the number being displayed exactly matches the number of millimeters that the depth gauge is sticking out. Let's take a look here. We want to measure the depth of this slot. So what I'm going to do is take the caliper, place it firmly against the piece of wood, and then I will slide the jaws apart as far as they go until the depth gauge hits the bottom of the slot. I can now see that the depth of that slot is 6.7 millimeters. Let's also assume that I want to determine the depth of the screw hole. Assuming the screw hole is wide enough for the depth gauge to fit in, I can measure the depth of that screw hole. I'll stick out the depth gauge just a little bit to line it up. I will then push it down as far as it will go, keep making sure to keep the bottom of the caliper flush against the piece of wood, remove it, and I can see that the depth of that screw hole is 13.2 millimeters deep.
We'll now look at the last method of using a caliper that's covered in this video, and that is called the step method. It allows you to record the height of one object related to another object. If you find this information useful, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because if you don't subscribe, YouTube will not pay me. And if YouTube will not pay me, I will end up living under a bridge.
I want to go over one last measuring method that we haven't covered yet, and that's called the step measurement. Let's assume that you have to measure the thickness of this piece of wood. Probably the first thing that will come to mind is, since we just covered the idea of using a depth gauge, would be to measure it with a depth gauge. And as you can see, it would work. You can actually see here the depth gauge hits the table, and it'd be pretty accurate, I guess. It says 19.8 millimeters. But there's a problem. You'll notice that even just holding it here, as I'm pushing down, it's a little bit wobbly. If I push down too hard, I'm on the edge of this piece of wood, so it's kind of a tendency to want to rotate. So the question is, how can we get a much more stable surface? And the good news is, we just have to turn over the caliper and then turn it upside down, and we have 2 flat surfaces. One along the bottom here, and one along the jaw that's moving. So if I go ahead and here and I move this jaw up and down, you can see that there's a flat surface here, and there's a flat surface here. If we turn it sideways, you can see obviously the 2 jaws can't take up the same space, so this one sticks out a little bit more than this one. So I'm going to take one of the jaws and set it here flat on the table. I'm then going to take the other jaw and lower it down onto the item to be measured. And now you've got a very stable surface. You can even see it, even with my shaky hands, it's not wobbling too much. And it's very, very secure. It's not going to move. Take this off when you take a look, and we can see that we have 20.1 millimeters. And so hopefully that shows that there's a better way to get the thickness than using the depth meter. Is you're actually going to go ahead and use what's called the step measurement method. And again, that uses the 2 flat surfaces on the back of the caliper with the depth gauge sticking up in the air, just out of the way, and you can measure how deep a step is.
Alright, let's now take a look at all these methods tied together in one very short example. And while I'm doing that, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button so I don't have to live under a bridge.
Let's review the 4 methods of measuring objects that we went over in this video. The first is using the caliper to measure the exterior of an object. The second is to measure the interior of an object. That method can also be used to determine the distance between objects, such as these two screws. The third method is to determine the depth of an object, such as the screw hole here. And last but not least, we also have the step method. The step method allows you to measure the distance between one object and another in terms of height. Those are the 4 methods we reviewed today. If you found them helpful, please hit the subscribe button so I don't have to live under a bridge.
Thank you for watching another video from the Clueless Dude's Real Tool Reviews channel. If you found the information helpful, I'd appreciate it greatly if you'd click the subscribe button. That's how YouTube knows I should get paid. Thanks again for your time.